Hi students, now I would like to discuss about a most important topic related to the civil services aspirants. That is how to score good marks in sociology if at all the students opt sociology as an optional for civil services mains examination, and how to understand sociology and how to improve their academic caliber on the subject, and how to present a best answer to the questions related to paper 1 and also paper 2. So those aspects now I would like to discuss. The student who choose sociology as an optional, first they are supposed to understand the basic concepts in sociology. This is very important, understanding the basic concepts in sociology. By going through the basic texts related to sociology, a student is supposed to understand the various concepts that are used in the study of human society, like socialization, social conflict, social stratification, social inequality, power and state, social change. So, like that, social deviance, like that, there are many concepts which are used in sociological analysis. So, every student must have a conceptual clarity. This is first important one. Secondly, understanding the theoretical contributions of the social thinkers like Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, R.K. Merton, and G.H. Mead. And according to syllabus, there are the topics related to these six thinkers. And each thinker has contributed to propound a sociological theory related to human society. For example, Karl Marx has propounded a theory of class struggle, a theory of alienation, and he has also talked about the concept of dialectical and historical materialism. So, similarly, Max Weber has talked about the concept of power and authority, and he has also introduced the theory of bureaucracy and theory of religion, and his theory is known as theory of the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism, and theory of social action. So similarly, Emile Durkheim has discussed about theory of division of labor and social solidarity, theory of suicide and theory of religion, and most importantly, he has introduced the concept of totemism. So, similarly, Talcott Parsons has also discussed about the theory of pattern variables, and R.K. Merton has discussed about theory of social structure and anomy, and G.H. Mead has discussed about a theory of mind, self, and society. So, a student must have a command on all these theories, and not only understanding this theory, and students should also think that whether these theories are relevant to the contemporary society or not. For example, take Marxian theory of class struggle. To what extent the content of the theory of class struggle is relevant to the modern capitalist society, whether it is relevant or not. Similarly, Max Weber has discussed about theory of bureaucracy. So to what extent Weber's theory of bureaucracy is relevant to the modern bureaucracy? So like that, a student is supposed to think and examine, and they have to apply this theory to the modern society, and they have to identify whether they are relevant or not relevant. If they are relevant, how they are relevant. If they are not relevant, how they are not relevant. So those aspects need to be analyzed by the student. This is very important. Then, as I told you, analysis of the content of sociological theories. In fact, especially in paper 1, there are many sociological theories related to social stratification, then power and state, religion, family system, economic system, and social change. So, student is supposed to understand these theories. Let me uh, briefly give you certain examples. For example, with regard to the power and state, there are certain theories propounded by functionalist theory of power propounded by Talcott Parsons, then Marxian conflict theory of power, then pluralist theory of power by D. Tocqueville, then neo-Marxist theory of power by Antonio Gramsci and Nikos Polanza. So a student must have understanding over all these theories in a in-depth manner. Similarly, there are certain theories related to social stratification as discussed by Talcott Parsons, Kingsley Davis, and Wilbert E. Moore, then Karl Marx, Max Weber. So all these theories are very important. Then with regard to religion, there are functionalist theories of religion, specifically discussed by Emil Durkheim, Malinowski, and other sociologists. Then conflict theory as discussed by Karl Marx and other sociologists. Then with regard to family, there are certain theories like functionalist theories as discussed by G.P. Murdoch, then Malinowski and Talcott Parsons. Then conflict theory related to family was discussed by Karl Marx and Engels. Then feminist theories, which were discussed by Anne Oakley and Shulamit Firestone. Then with regard to social change, there are theories like evolutionary theory of social change discussed by Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, Emil Durkheim, then functionalist theory of social change discussed by Talcott Parsons, then conflict theory of social change discussed by Karl Marx, then world system theory of Immanuel Wallerstein, then dependency theory discussed by A.G. Frank. So like that, all these theories are very important in paper 1, and a student must understand the content of these theories and application of these sociological theories to the modern society. So this is very important. Then critical analysis of the relevance or non-relevance of sociological theories and perspectives of social thinkers to the contemporary societies. Especially in paper 1, understanding the perspective of the different social thinkers like functionalist perspective, conflict perspective, interactionist perspective, feminist perspective, subaltern perspective. So like all these perspectives are very important, and how these perspectives are useful to understand the modern society and more specifically to understand the Indian society. It's very important. Then how these perspectives and theories are relevant to the contemporary capitalist societies in the world, and apart from that, how they are relevant to the Indian society. So that kind of analysis has to be made by the student while understanding these theories and perspectives. Then from the examination point of view, comparative analysis of sociological thought of various social thinkers is also very important. If you look at the previous year question papers, many times a comparative kind of questions were asked, like uh, comparing the views of Karl Marx and Max Weber on class and capitalism, or comparing the views of Marx and Weber on religion, comparing the views of Karl Marx and Emil Durkheim on religion. Similarly, comparing the views of Talcott Parsons and the neo-Marxist thinkers like Antonio Gramsci and Nikos Polanza on power and state. So like that, different types of questions can be asked to compare the views of one thinker with another thinker. So this is also very important. And understanding the structure, functions, and changing trends of the basic social institutions like family system, marriage system, economic system, political system, religious system, and educational system. Many times, a question was asked with regard to the changing trends in family and marriage system in contemporary Indian society. And similarly, questions were asked related to the changing trends in the economic system or the changing trends in the political system or political dynamics. So these kind of questions are asked with regard to the basic social institutions. Then another important aspect is understanding the structure and issues of Indian society and challenges to the contemporary Indian society. First of all, a student must have an in-depth understanding about the basic structure of the Indian society. So while uh, reading about Indian society, a student must understand the basic social institutions in Indian society like family system, marriage system, economic system, political system, and more specifically the caste system in Indian society, then agrarian society in Indian society, then tribal society in India, and how the various tribes are distributed in different geographical regions, what are their specific problems, and what are the initiatives of the government of India for rural development and tribal development, and how these rural development programs are impacting on Indian rural society, what kind of changes that have been occurred due to the effective implementation of all these rural development programs or tribal development programs. So this kind of analysis is very much required, especially in paper 2. And analysis of social, economic, and political issues and dynamics in Indian society. This is again very important. As I said, if you look at the caste system is a unique social system in Indian society. But because of the influence of various factors, like due to the impact of modern education and scientific and secular education, social legislations, social reform movements, industrialization and urbanization, many changes took place in the caste system. So, what are the trends in the caste system and whether the caste system will vanish in the course of time or caste system will continue to exist in future? So this kind of logical argument is very much required with regard to the issues of Indian society, and more specifically when we talk about the challenges to the contemporary Indian society, there are certain issues like communalism, secularism, regionalism, casteism, poverty, unemployment. All these are considered as the major challenges to Indian society. Then a student is supposed to have a broad idea about this. Then a student is supposed to analyze the issue and identify the factors responsible for that issue and what kind of initiatives have been made by the government of India and respect to state governments to solve those issues, and what kind of suggestions we can make to uh, prevent that problem or to solve that particular problem. So this kind of thinking is very much required, especially for paper 2. Then most importantly, continuous practice of writing answers by using sociological language and terminology. This is very important. While reading certain standard books like Sociology by Anthony Giddens, Sociology Themes and Perspectives by Harlambus and Holborn, then Contemporary Sociology by Francis Abraham, then Modern Social Theory by George Ridger. Like there are many standard books related to sociology. So while going through these books, student can understand the various kind of terminology, various types of concepts that are used in sociological analysis. So capturing the sociological language and the terminology is very important, and a student is supposed to write the answer by using uh, such type of sociological language or sociological terminology. And so that student can score very good marks. Then another aspect is building a logical and scientific argument by quoting certain empirical studies and drawing a logical conclusion. Yeah. As far as the paper 1 is concerned, there are many topics where the logical and scientific argument is required, especially with regard to the topics like social stratification, power and state, religion, then political institutions. So, for such kind of topics, a student is supposed to build a logical and scientific argument to present an effective answer. And for those kind of questions, student is supposed to mention the argument of the different social thinkers. For example, when we discuss about the power and state, sometimes a question can be asked that in the context of globalization, do you think that the identity of the state is becoming insignificant? So then there are many arguments. So we need to look at this issue from the Marxian point of view, from the point of view of Antonio Gramsci, and there are certain sociologists who talked about Kenichi Ohama, then Anthony Giddens. So many sociologists have discussed about this power and state. So that argument you need to include in the answer. Then when it comes to paper 2, specifically for certain topics, the empirical studies conducted by the sociologists need to be mentioned. For example, when if at all a question is related to the caste system, then caste dynamics in Indian society are changing trends in the caste system. Student is supposed to present the essence of the empirical studies conducted by the sociologists like G.S. Ghurye, M.N. Srinivas, Andri Betille, Yogendra Singh, Louis Dumont, and David Hardiman. Because each of them, they have studied about the caste system with a particular sociological perspective. So, if the student is able to mention such kind of empirical studies as part of their answer, so that they can impress upon the examiner, and that will help them to score good marks. Similarly, when we talk about family, marriage and kinship system, there are certain studies conducted by the Indian sociologists like D.N. Majumdar, K.M. Kapadia, Airavati Karve, then G.S. Ghurye. So, the empirical studies of these thinkers can be mentioned if at all a question is related to the family, marriage and kinship system. Similarly, uh, if the question is related to the importance of the study of Indian villages, many Indian and European scholars have studied Indian villages, and a student is supposed to mention the empirical studies conducted by S.C. Dubey, M.N. Srinivas, Andri Betille, then A.R. Desai, G.S. Ghurye. Like, if the student is able to mention these empirical studies to justify their answer, and such kind of presentation would help them to score good marks. So that is called building a logical and scientific argument by quoting certain empirical studies and drawing a logical conclusion. Then another important aspect is presentation of answer in a logical order. This is very, very important. As I said, a student is supposed to present an effective answer to score good marks. So how to make their answer effective? That effectiveness is based on the content, then referring to the sociological perspectives and theories of the thinkers and their studies, then building a logical and scientific argument, and wherever possible mentioning certain empirical studies, then presenting the answer in a logical order by using sociological language and sociological terminology. And answer should contain a brief introduction, and introduction must be always effective. Then later on, analysis about the that answer related to a particular topic, then building logical argument with empirical studies or evidences. Then at the end, a student is supposed to draw a logical conclusion with most appropriate suggestions or solutions wherever it is required. So then presentation of answer in a decent academic language. A student is supposed to write the answer in a decent language, in academic language. Academic language is nothing but once the student go through certain standard books, as I told you, the books of certain prominent sociologists, and that help the student to catch the sociological language. So they have to write the answer by using such kind of sociological language. Then the present the answer in a descriptive and analytical form and in paragraphs. This is also very, very important. Civil services examination demands a descriptive analysis. This is not a kind of examination where a student is supposed to uh, write the answer in just simply in some points. No, every question demands certain descriptive analysis. So that is why my suggestion is that a student is supposed to present the answer in a descriptive way, in an analytical way, and that should be presented in the form of small paragraphs. And wherever possible, they can give some flowcharts, but all the time flowcharts are not necessary. And depending upon the nature of the question, what exactly question demands, based on that, answer can be presented in the form of different points. And if the question demands an analysis, then answer must be always in the form of paragraphs. So if the student is able to present the answer by following all these precautions, definitely they can score good marks. So these kind of precautions are required for a student to score good marks if at all they opt sociology as an optional subject for civil services mains examination. Thank you.